The smell of antiseptic burned the nostrils, that hospital odor mixing ether with the proximity of death. And Eleanor Vance squeezed her mother's hand with such force that her fingers began to ache, but she didn't let go. She couldn't let go because she knew this was the last day, the last hour, the last few minutes she would have with the woman who gave her life, here at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, in room 312 at the end of the cold corridor where nurses hurried past, avoiding looking inside because they knew someone was departing, and Eleanor cried so much she could barely see her mother's face through the thick tears that streamed relentlessly. Because it wasn't fair. First, her father had died in a car crash on the Long Island Expressway 3 years ago, and now her mother was wasting away from a cancer that had eaten everything inside. And she was alone in the world at 23 with no one, completely alone. And her mother tried to speak, but her voice came out weak. So weak that Eleanor had to press her ear to the woman's dry lips to hear, "Honey, you have to promise me something." And Eleanor shook her head desperately because she already knew she wouldn't like what was coming. "No, Mom, don't say that. You're going to get better. You're going to leave here and we'll live together again." But her mother squeezed her hand with a strength that seemed impossible from such a fragile body. "Listen to what I'm saying, Eleanor. Promise me you'll marry the heir of the Davenport family. Arthur Davenport made me a promise when your father died. He said he would take care of you, that his son Alexander would marry you and you would never want for anything." And Eleanor felt the world crumble because she didn't know this Alexander, had never seen him in her life, only knew that the Davenport family owned half the real estate development firms in New York, and that old Arthur had been her father's partner many years ago before they became rich. "No, Mom, I can't promise that. I don't love this man. I don't even know him." But her mother began to cough, that dry, painful cough that made her whole body tremble, and the heart monitor started beeping faster, and the nurses rushed in. And in the midst of all that chaos, her mother held Eleanor's face between her trembling hands and said with her eyes already glazing over, "Promise, honey, for the love of God, promise, or you'll be left alone with nothing in this world." And Eleanor couldn't refuse, couldn't say no to that woman who was dying in front of her. So she whispered with a broken voice, "I promise, Mum, I promise I'll marry him." And it was as if those words were the last thing her mother needed to hear, because she smiled even through the pain and suffering, and slowly closed her eyes as the monitor began to make that continuous, high-pitched sound that meant it was over, that life was gone. And Eleanor screamed so loud she must have woken the entire hospital. No, it can't be. Come back, Mom. Please come back." But it was no use screaming because her mother was gone forever, leaving her daughter alone in the world with only a promise as heavy as a chain around her neck. Eleanor left the hospital, stumbling through the streets of New York, which were wet from a fine, cold November drizzle, the kind that isn't quite rain but soaks you just the same. And she walked aimlessly through the West Village, not knowing where to go because the rented apartment was too empty now, empty and cold and full of memories. So she kept walking until her legs ached, and the night's chill began to penetrate her thin coat. And that's when she passed a small bar in the East Village playing low, soulful blues, the kind her father used to love, and she went in without much thought, sat in a dark corner and ordered a shot of bourbon, and then another and another, because she wanted to forget, wanted to erase the sound of that heart monitor flatlining, wanted not to think about the promise she had just made, about the marriage to a stranger that awaited her. And as the bourbon burned her throat and clouded her head, she didn't even notice when a man sat at the next table, a tall man in a dark suit, who also seemed to be running from something, who also drank as if he wanted to forget the world. And it was like that, in the midst of pain and alcohol and the music playing in the background, that their eyes met for the first time. And there was something in that look that made Eleanor's heart stop for a second. Something she couldn't explain, but that felt like recognition, as if their souls already knew each other from another life. And the man smiled, a crooked, sad smile, and said only, "You running from something too?" And Eleanor didn't know if he was talking about running from a place or from life itself. But she answered, "I'm trying to." And he raised his glass in a silent toast, and she did the same. And that's how it began, without a plan, without thinking of the consequences. When he extended his hand and said, "Want to dance?" And she accepted, even though she knew she shouldn't, even knowing she had just promised her mother she would marry another man. But right then, none of that mattered because the pain was too great, and she needed something, anything, to make that pain go away, if only for a few hours. They danced in the middle of the bar as the blues gave way to a slower song, and his body was warm against hers, and the woody cologne he wore mixed with the smell of bourbon. And Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder, and for the first time since her mother died, felt something other than pain, felt a warmth spread through her chest, a desire to stay there forever in that embrace of strangers who understood each other without needing to speak. And when the music ended, he held her face between his large hands and kissed her. And it wasn't a shy or delicate kiss. It was an urgent, desperate kiss, as if they were both drowning. And that kiss was the only air available in the world. And Eleanor responded with the same intensity, because in that moment she was no longer the girl who had just lost her mother, no longer the obedient daughter who had made a promise. She was just a woman who wanted to feel something, anything that wasn't that horrible pain consuming her from within. And so, between kisses and shots of bourbon and glances that said more than 1,000 words, they left the bar hand in hand, stumbling on the wet sidewalks of the East Village, laughing at things that weren't funny but seemed hilarious in their drunken state. And he hailed a cab and gave an address Eleanor didn't pay attention to, and in the backseat of the car they continued to kiss like teenagers in love. And the driver pretended not to see in the rearview mirror, and when they arrived at a small discreet hotel on a side street in Midtown, he paid the cabbie and pulled her inside, and the receptionist handed over a key without asking questions, because he'd seen that scene 1,000 times. Drunken couples looking for a place to spend the night, and in the dark room with the smell of artificial lavender, the clothes fell to the floor, and his hands explored her body with an urgency that made her forget everything. And she gave herself completely, let him touch her in ways no one had ever touched her, let him make her feel things she didn't even know were possible. And it was there, on that forbidden night between white sheets that smelled of laundry detergent, that Eleanor Vance lost more than her virginity. She also lost the last piece of innocence she had left, and the man whose name she didn't even know held her in his arms afterward, stroking her dark hair as they both tried to catch their breath. And she felt safe there, safe in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. And that's why she ended up falling asleep nestled against his chest, exhausted by the pain and the alcohol and everything that had happened on that impossible day. The morning light streamed through the curtainless window when Eleanor opened her eyes, and for a few seconds she didn't know where she was, until the headache pounding at her temples and the nausea rising in her throat made her remember everything. Her mother dying, the bar, the man, and she turned her head slowly and saw him there sleeping beside her, his face relaxed and handsome in the daylight. And it was in that moment that the guilt hit her hard, a guilt so immense it felt like a physical weight crushing her chest, because my God, what had she done? She had promised her mother she would marry the Davenport heir, and on the very same night she had slept with a complete stranger, had given herself body and soul to a man whose name she didn't even know. And now how was she going to face her future husband? How was she going to face his family, knowing she had betrayed the promise before it even began? And the tears started to stream down her face again as she slowly got out of bed, picked up her clothes scattered on the floor, dressed with hands shaking so much she could barely button her dress, and looked for her purse which she had dropped near the door. And when she picked up the silk scarf her mother had given her for her last birthday, she didn't notice that the thin silver necklace she always wore, that simple necklace with the initials EV engraved on it that her father had given her for her 15th birthday, slipped from her neck and fell silently among the crumpled sheets. And she left the room without looking back, ran down the stairs, past the reception desk, ignoring the curious look of the receptionist, and went out into the street, where the New York morning was already awake and noisy. And she walked aimlessly, crying softly, feeling like the worst person in the world, feeling that she had stained her mother's memory, that she had destroyed everything before it even started. Alexander Davenport woke up with a heavy head and a dry mouth, and it took him a few seconds to remember where he was and what had happened the night before. And when the memory returned, he turned to the side expecting to see the woman who had been in his arms, but the space was empty, and he sat up in bed, running his hands over his face, trying to organize his thoughts, because the night before had been too intense. It had been different from anything he had ever experienced, and he, who had always been a cold and calculating man, who had always kept his emotions under control, had completely lost himself in the arms of that stranger, and now she was gone without a word. without leaving a phone number, without even leaving her name, and Alexander felt a frustration grow inside him. An urge to run out and search for her through the streets of New York. But how could he find someone when he didn't even know who she was? And it was then that something glinted amidst the white sheets. And he reached out his hand and picked up the thin silver necklace and looked at the engraved initials EV. And it was so little, but it was all he had of her. And he closed his fist around the necklace, feeling the cold metal against his skin. And that's when he noticed the stains on the sheet, stains that revealed that this woman had been a virgin, that she had given herself to him for the first time. And Alexander felt a strange tightness in his chest, a mixture of guilt and fascination, and an inexplicable desire to find her again, to ask her why she had run away, to know who this woman with the sad eyes was, who had affected him in a way no one ever had. And he put the necklace in his suit pocket as if it were a precious treasure, and dressed slowly, and left the hotel with his mind buzzing with unanswered questions, not knowing that in a few hours he would have to go to his lawyer's office to sign the papers for an arranged marriage his father had set up, not knowing that the woman he was desperate to find was the very bride he swore he never wanted to meet. Arthur Davenport's office was on the top floor of a commercial building on Park Avenue, with enormous windows overlooking the entire city, and Alexander walked in still hungover from the night before, still with the stranger's necklace burning in his pocket, and his father was sitting behind the mahogany desk, a man in his 60s with graying hair and a stern gaze, and he pointed to the chair in front of him without ceremony. "Sit down. We need to talk." And Alexander threw himself into the leather armchair, sighing, "If this is about the marriage, Dad, I've already told you I don't want it. That's something from the old world. Arranged marriages don't happen anymore." But Arthur slammed his hand on the desk, making the papers jump. "Don't give me that, Alexander. I gave my word to Vance before he died. I promised his daughter would never want for anything, that you would marry her and take care of her. And a Davenport does not break his word." And Alexander stood up, annoyed. "Vance died 3 years ago, Dad, and now the girl's mother is dead too. There's no one left to hold you to this promise." But his father also stood, leaning his hands on the desk. "Yes, there is. There's the girl herself who's been left alone in the world, and there's my honor at stake. It was because of Vance that we were able to expand the business when the company was broke. He was the one who lent us money when no one else believed in us. And now that he and his wife are dead, their daughter is out there with nothing, and you will fulfill what I promised. You will marry Eleanor Vance, and that's final." And Alexander ran his hands through his hair in desperation, because how was he going to marry a stranger when the only thing he could think about was the woman from last night, the way she had moaned softly when he touched her, the way she had clung to him as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. "Fine, Dad, fine, I'll marry her, but don't ask me to love this woman. Don't ask me to be faithful. This will be just a contract, just a signed piece of paper for you to keep your damn honor intact." And Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, as if those words had hurt. But when he opened them again, his gaze was firm. "Then sign the papers. The lawyer has arranged it for this afternoon at his office." And Alexander left, slamming the door, went down to the parking garage, got into his imported car and sat there in the leather seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly, feeling the necklace in his pocket burning like an ember. And he took it out and looked at the initials again, EV, and a part of him wanted to throw it away and forget. But another part, the part that had woken up alone that morning feeling a strange emptiness in his chest, held the necklace tightly and swore to himself that he would find that woman, no matter what it cost. Eleanor was sitting on the old sofa in her West Village apartment, staring at the empty walls, the few remaining pieces of furniture, the family photos still hanging, and her phone rang. And she answered with a weak voice, and it was the Davenport family's lawyer saying she needed to come to the office that afternoon to sign the marriage papers. And Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the promise tighten in her chest, because this was it. There was no turning back. Her mother had died and left her tied to a commitment she didn't want, tied to a man she had never seen, and worse. Now she had this horrible secret, that night with the stranger that would haunt her forever. And she got ready slowly, put on a dark blue dress her mother liked, tied her dark hair into a simple bun and went out, taking the subway downtown because she didn't have money for a cab. And when she arrived at the lawyer's office, it was in an old building that smelled of musty paper and heavy silence. and the receptionist led her to a room where the lawyer was waiting with a folder full of documents. And Eleanor asked with a trembling voice, "And the groom, isn't he coming?" And the lawyer answered without looking at her, "Mr. Davenport requested that you sign separately. He will arrange for his signature later." And that felt like a slap in the face, because the man hadn't even come to his own wedding, hadn't even had the decency to show up and look at her. And Eleanor felt tears burn her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She took the pen the lawyer offered and signed where he indicated, one name after another. Eleanor Vance, Eleanor Vance, Eleanor Vance, until at the end of the document she had to sign her new name, Eleanor Vance Davenport, and she wrote those letters feeling like she was signing her own prison sentence. And when she finished, the lawyer collected the papers and said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Davenport. You are now part of the family." But there was nothing congratulatory about it. There was no family. There was only loneliness and shame, and the weight of a secret she would carry forever. Alexander was in his office at the development firm, looking out the window at the chaotic traffic on the FDR drive, and the lawyer had called saying that the bride had already signed the papers and that he needed to go to the office too. But Alexander had said no to send the documents for him to sign at his office because he didn't want to see this woman, didn't want to look at the face of the person who would be his wife only on paper. And when the documents arrived, he flipped through them quickly without paying much attention, just looking for the place to sign. And that's when he saw her full name written there, Eleanor Vance, and something inside him trembled. Because Eleanor started with E, and Vance started with V-E-V, the same initials as the necklace he carried in his pocket. And he took out the necklace and looked again at the engraved letters, E-V, and then looked at the name on the document, Eleanor Vance, and his heart began to beat faster. Because it couldn't be. It wasn't possible that the woman from that night was the same one he had just married on paper, but the initials matched, and he went back to the first page of the document looking for more information, and there was a small photo attached, a passport-style photo of the bride. And when Alexander looked at that photo, he felt the floor disappear from under his feet, because it was her, it was the woman from the bar, the woman with the sad eyes, the woman who had given herself into his arms and then run away, leaving only a necklace as a memento. And Alexander dropped the papers on the desk and ran his hands over his face in shock, trying to process this impossible information, because how could it be? How could fate have played such a trick? The woman he was desperately looking for, the woman who wouldn't leave his mind, was the very wife he swore he never wanted to meet. And he didn't know whether to laugh or cry, didn't know if this was a blessing or a curse, because suddenly everything had changed. The arranged marriage that seemed like a prison had turned into something completely different. It had turned into the possibility of finding the woman who had stirred him in a way no one ever had. But at the same time, he wondered why she hadn't said anything that night, why she had run away, and did she know who he was? Had it all been calculated? And suspicion began to grow inside him, mixed with attraction and desire. And Alexander picked up the phone and called the lawyer. "I need all the information on Eleanor Vance. Everything, where she lives, who she talks to, what she does. I want to know everything about her." And the lawyer hesitated. "But sir, she's your wife now." And Alexander interrupted. "Exactly, because she's my wife, but I know nothing about her. So investigate and bring me everything you find." And he hung up the phone and stood there in the middle of his office, holding the necklace between his fingers, looking at the initials EV, and a part of him wanted to run to her address and confront her, ask her why she hadn't said anything, but another part was afraid of what he would find, afraid that that night that seemed so real had been just a farce. Eleanor was lying on the bed in the empty apartment, staring at the cracked ceiling, and her body ached from so much crying. And she brought her hand to her neck, looking for the necklace she always wore, the one her father had given her, but she didn't find it. And that's when she realized she must have lost it. And she tried to remember where she had seen it last. And the memory of the night in the hotel came back with force. And she realized she must have dropped it there, in the room, and now she didn't even have that. She had nothing left to connect her to her father, and the tears started falling again. And that's when the doorbell rang, and Eleanor got up, confused because she wasn't expecting anyone. And when she opened the door, it was a well-dressed woman in her 30s, smiling, and she said, "Hi, you must be Eleanor. I'm Chloe. We worked with your father a few years ago. I heard about your mother's passing and came to offer my condolences." And Eleanor let her in, even though she didn't really remember the woman, because she was so tired and lonely that any company seemed better than being alone with her own thoughts. And Chloe sat on the sofa and talked, asking questions about how Eleanor was feeling, about her plans for the future. And Eleanor ended up telling her everything, told her about the promise her mother had extracted on her deathbed, about the arranged marriage she had signed that afternoon, and in a moment of weakness her voice choked with emotion. She also told her about the night at the bar, about the man she had met, about how she had given herself completely to a stranger. And Chloe listened to everything in silence, but her gaze changed, became more attentive, more interested. And when Eleanor finished speaking, Chloe sighed and said with a voice that tried to sound compassionate but carried judgment, "Wow, Eleanor, you spent the night with a man you didn't even know. On the same day as your mother's funeral, how could you do that?" And Eleanor felt shame burn her face. I know it was wrong. I was desperate. I was lost." But Chloe shook her head slowly. "Sorry to be blunt, but that was very irresponsible. You acted without thinking of the consequences. And now you're a married woman. What do you think your husband will think when he finds out?" And her words were like sharp knives cutting Eleanor's skin, and she cried softly, I know. I ruined everything." And Chloe placed a hand on her shoulder in a gesture that seemed comforting but was actually planting seeds of guilt and despair. "Look, I'm not going to judge you, but you need to be careful. You need to keep this secret very well guarded, because if the Davenport family finds out, your life will become a living hell." And Eleanor nodded, wiping her tears, not realizing that Chloe was already filing that information away in her head, already thinking about how she could use it to her advantage, because Chloe had her own plans, her own interests, and had just discovered a secret that could be very useful in the future. The weeks passed and Eleanor lived like a ghost in the West Village apartment, supported by the allowance the Davenport family's lawyers deposited into her account each month, a generous amount that ensured she wouldn't want for anything, but at the same time made her feel like an expensive prostitute, because that's what she was in the end, a woman who had sold her freedom in exchange for financial security. And the husband she had on paper remained invisible. He didn't call, didn't text, didn't show up, and she would lie there in that apartment, wondering if he even knew she existed, if he even had any curiosity to know who he had married. And it was during one of these lonely afternoons that Eleanor began to feel something strange, a dizziness that wouldn't go away, a nausea that came every morning and made her run to the bathroom. And at first she thought it was just stress, just grief for her mother, just the sadness of being alone in the world. But when the nausea persisted for 2 straight weeks, she began to suspect, and the suspicion turned to fear, and the fear turned to panic, because it couldn't be what she was thinking. It wasn't possible that that single night with the stranger had resulted in this, but her body didn't lie. Her breasts were sore, her period hadn't come, and Eleanor left the house trembling, went to a pharmacy far from her neighborhood where no one would know her, bought 3 different pregnancy tests because she couldn't trust just one, and rushed back home, locked herself in the bathroom, took the first test with hands shaking so much she almost dropped it, and waited for the longest 3 minutes of her life. And when she looked at the result and saw the 2 pink lines, her world collapsed again. And she took the second test and the third, and they all came back positive, and Eleanor slid down the bathroom wall to the cold floor, hugging her knees, crying desperately, "Mom, forgive me, I ruined everything. I promised I would marry Alexander Davenport, and now I'm pregnant with another man's child. How am I going to face him? How am I going to live with this lie?" And she stayed there on the bathroom floor for who knows how long, until she managed to get up and go to the bedroom, lay on the bed and hugged the pillow. And for the first time since discovering the pregnancy, another feeling began to grow alongside the fear, a strange and unexpected feeling. Because inside her a life was growing, a small piece of her and of that man from the night at the bar. And even if everything was wrong, even if it was all an impossible mess, that baby was hers. It was the only thing in the world that was truly hers. And she placed her hand on her still flat stomach and whispered, "I don't know what I'm going to do, but I promise I will protect you. I promise I won't let anything bad happen to you." Alexander was sitting in his office when the lawyer showed up with a folder full of documents, and he opened it eagerly, looking for information about Eleanor, and read everything carefully. the address in the West Village, the English literature degree she had put on hold when her mother got sick, the fact that she had no other living relatives, that she had been living alone since her mother died. And there were also photos, recent photos that the private investigator had taken. And Alexander looked at each one, feeling his chest tighten. Because there she was, the woman from the bar, the woman who wouldn't leave his mind, walking through the streets of New York with that sad expression on her face, buying groceries, sitting alone in a cafe, and he wanted to go to her, wanted to knock on her door and ask why she hadn't said anything that night, why she had run away, but something held him back. Maybe it was the fear of finding out that that night had meant nothing to her, that it had just been a moment of weakness, and so he decided he would watch for now. He would find out who she really was before revealing himself. And that's when his father entered the office without knocking. With that same severe expression, "Alexander, so we need to talk about your wife." And Alexander quickly closed the folder as if he'd been caught doing something wrong. "What about her?" And Arthur sat in the chair in front of the desk. "What about her is that you married the girl and haven't even met her. That's disrespectful, Alexander. Eleanor is a decent young woman. She's lost her parents. She's alone in the world. And you don't even have the decency to introduce her to the family." And Alexander ran his hands through his hair. Irritated, "Dad, this marriage was your idea. Not mine. I did my part. I signed the papers. I made sure she wouldn't want for anything. What more do you want?" But Arthur slammed his hand on the desk. "I want you to act like a man. I want you to take responsibility. This girl is your wife before God and the law, and you'll have to live with her sooner or later." And Alexander stood up from his chair. "Fine, Dad, fine, I'll meet her, but on my time, my way." And he left the office before his father could reply, and went to the parking garage, got in his car and sat there gripping the steering wheel, and took the necklace from his pocket where he always kept it, and looked at the initials EV, and for the 1,000th time since that night, he wondered who this woman really was. And now he knew her name, knew her address, knew everything about her. But at the same time, he felt he knew nothing, because the information on paper said nothing about who she really was, about what she felt, about why her eyes were so sad that night in the bar. Chloe Fisher had her own plans and always had, ever since she was a little girl living on the outskirts of New York. Watching her mother work as a maid in the homes of the rich, she had sworn that one day she would get out of that life. She would get into the world of moneyed people. And she had succeeded. She had studied, gotten a business degree, landed a job in one of the Davenport Group's companies, and was climbing slowly but steadily. And when she found out that Alexander Davenport had married Vance's daughter, she was furious. Because she had spent months trying to get his attention, always well-dressed, always smiling, always available, but he had never looked at her that way. And now he was married to a futureless orphan who hadn't even finished college. And it wasn't fair, but Chloe was smart. She knew how to wait for the right moment. And when she went to visit Eleanor and discovered the secret of the night at the bar, discovered that she was pregnant with another man's child, she knew she had found the perfect weapon, because if she played her cards right, so if she knew how to use that information at the right time, she might still get what she wanted. She might still get Alexander's attention. She might even take the place that should have been hers from the start. And that's why she started visiting Eleanor more often. Always bringing food, always asking how she was, always playing the friend, and Eleanor, who was so lonely and desperate, accepted this friendship without any suspicion, not realizing that every word she said was being mentally noted by Chloe. Every weakness she showed was being catalogued. Every secret she revealed was being stored for future use. And when Eleanor finally told her she was pregnant, that she had found out from the tests that she didn't know what to do, Chloe placed a hand on her shoulder and said with that sweet, poisonous voice, "You have to ask for a divorce. Eleanor, it's the only way out. Because when the Davenport family finds out you're pregnant with another man's child, they will destroy you. They will say you're a tramp, that you tricked them. It's better for you to get out of this before it's too late." And Eleanor listened to those words, feeling the fear grow, because it made sense. How was she going to hide a belly for 9 months? How was she going to explain when the baby was born? And Chloe continued to plant the seeds of doubt. Think about it. Will you be able to look at Alexander knowing you're carrying another man's child? Will you be able to live with that lie forever? And Eleanor shook her head, crying, "No, I won't be able to. You're right. I need to ask for a divorce. I need to get out of this before I hurt more people." And Chloe smiled inwardly, satisfied, because everything was going according to plan. The months went by and Eleanor's belly began to grow. Just a little at first, almost imperceptible, but then more and more, and she wore loose clothes to hide it. Avoided leaving the house, lived locked in that West Village apartment like a prisoner. And that's when she decided Chloe was right, that she needed to ask for a divorce, that she couldn't keep living this lie. So she called the lawyer and requested a meeting with the Davenport family. And the lawyer seemed surprised. "Are you sure, Mrs. Davenport?" And she replied with a firm voice, "I am. I need to resolve this as soon as possible." And they scheduled it for the following week. And Eleanor spent those days rehearsing what she would say, how she would ask for a divorce without explaining the real reason. But when the day came and she entered that enormous Davenport mansion on the Upper East Side, with its crystal chandeliers and expensive paintings on the walls, and saw old Arthur sitting in an armchair like a judge, with lawyers at his side and some relatives scattered around the room, she felt her legs go weak. But she took a deep breath and said with a trembling but resolute voice, "Mr. Davenport, I've come to ask for a divorce." And the silence that followed was heavy, until the old man banged his cane on the floor with force. "A divorce? Do you know what you're asking, girl? Do you know the weight of the promise that was made?" And Eleanor tried to keep her voice steady. "Yes, sir, I do, but this marriage doesn't make sense. I've never seen my husband. He never wanted to meet me. We signed a piece of paper, but there's nothing between us, so it's better to end this now." And Arthur was about to reply when Chloe, who had managed to be present at the meeting as a sort of support for Eleanor, took a step forward and said in that calculated voice, "Mr. Davenport, perhaps Eleanor has other reasons for wanting a divorce." And Eleanor turned to her. Startled, Chloe, no, but it was too late. Because Chloe continued, "The truth is, Eleanor is pregnant." And the impact of those words was like a bomb exploding in the middle of the room, and everyone started talking at once. And Arthur rose from his armchair with difficulty, his face red with anger. "Pregnant? You're pregnant and you dare to come here and ask for a divorce?" And Eleanor was crying. "I didn't want anyone to know like this. It wasn't supposed to be like this." And one of Alexander's aunts, a woman in her 50s, with a face that looked like it had never smiled, said loudly, "This is a disgrace. She's deceived the entire family. Married our Alexander while pregnant with another man's child." And another aunt added, "That's why she wants a divorce, to hide her shame." And Eleanor wanted to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. And that's when Arthur raised his hand asking for silence, and looked at her with a mixture of disappointment and weariness. "Very well, Miss Vance, if that's what you want. The divorce will be granted. I won't force anyone to remain in a family they don't want to be a part of." And Eleanor felt a mix of relief and sadness, because this was it. It was over. The promise her mother had extracted was broken, but at the same time she felt she had failed, that she had disappointed the memory of her parents, and she left that mansion crying without looking back, without seeing the triumphant look on Chloe's face as she stayed behind, watching it all unfold. Alexander was in Barcelona when he got the call from his father. He had traveled 2 weeks earlier to resolve issues at one of the group's international construction sites, and when he answered his phone and heard his father's grave voice on the other end, "Alexander, your wife was here asking for a divorce." He was silent for a few seconds, processing the information, and then he asked, "And you accepted?" And Arthur sighed, "We haven't signed anything yet, but there's more. She's pregnant." And Alexander felt the floor drop out from under him. Pregnant? And his mind started working fast, doing the math. Because if she was pregnant and it had happened that night at the bar, then the child was his. It was impossible for it to be anyone else's, because the investigators had checked, and she didn't go out with anyone, didn't have a boyfriend, had nothing. So the only explanation was that that night had had consequences, and Alexander felt something strange in his chest, a mixture of fear and excitement, because he was going to be a father. He had a child growing inside the woman who wouldn't leave his mind. But at the same time he was furious, because why hadn't she told him? Why had she come asking for a divorce instead of talking to him? And his father continued, "The whole family knows it was a scandal. She showed up here with a friend, and the friend was the one who revealed the pregnancy, and now everyone is saying she deceived us." that she married while pregnant with another man's child. And Alexander gripped the phone tightly. "Dad, I'll be back as soon as I sort things out here. But in the meantime, don't sign anything, do you hear me? And no divorce until I get back." And Arthur seemed confused. "But why, Alexander? You yourself said you didn't want this marriage." And Alexander looked out the hotel window at the city of Barcelona. "I've changed my mind, Dad. Just don't sign anything until I'm back." And he hung up before his father could ask any more questions. And he stood there thinking, trying to decide what to do. Because a part of him wanted to take the first flight back and confront Eleanor, ask her why she was running away, why she hadn't told him about the baby. But another part was afraid that she didn't want to be with him, afraid that that night had meant nothing to her. And as he thought about it, he took the necklace he always carried in his pocket and looked at the initials EV. And he made a decision. He would go back, yes. But first he would hire the best detective he could find. He would find out everything about that night. He would be absolutely sure that this baby was his. And only then would he confront Eleanor and make her understand that there was no escape, that they were bound together forever now. Eleanor spent the following months living in a strange limbo. The Davenport family had accepted her divorce request, but the papers still hadn't been signed. And she continued to receive the allowance every month, and her belly continued to grow. And she was already 6 months along when she woke up one morning with sharp pains that weren't normal. And she called for an ambulance and was taken to Mount Sinai, the same hospital where her mother had died. And the doctors said there were complications, that the baby was in distress, that they needed to perform an emergency C-section, even though she was only at 28 weeks. And Eleanor was terrified. "Please save my baby. Do whatever it takes, but save him." And the doctors took her to the operating room and she was anesthetized. And when she woke up a few hours later, she was in a white room that smelled of antiseptic. And a nurse came to her, smiling. "Congratulations, Mom, you had a beautiful baby boy. He's in the neonatal ICU, but he's stable." And Eleanor began to cry with relief. "Can I see him?" And the nurse said yes, that in a few hours when she was more recovered, she could go to the NICU. And Eleanor lay there looking at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened, thinking about the mother who wasn't there to meet her grandson, thinking about the baby's father whom she didn't even know, thinking about how she was going to raise this child alone. And that's when she heard the room door open. And she turned her head expecting to see the nurse. But the person who entered was a tall man in a dark suit. And when Eleanor looked at his face, her heart stopped, because it was him, the man from the bar, the man from the night that changed everything. And she tried to speak, but no sound came out. And he approached the bed slowly, his eyes fixed on her, and said with a choked voice, "Hi, Eleanor," and she whispered, "How do you know my name?" And he smiled sadly. "I know a lot more than that. I know you're my wife. I know that baby in the NICU is my son. I know everything." And Eleanor felt the world spin. "You're Alexander." And he nodded. "I am. And you're the woman I've spent the last few months looking for without knowing I had already found you on the very night we met at the bar." And Eleanor began to cry. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. If I had known you were my husband, I never would have run away like that." And Alexander sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand. "I know, Eleanor, I know. The detective I hired found out everything. Found out you had just lost your mother that night. Found out you didn't even know who I was. Found out that night was as important to you as it was to me." And he took the necklace from his pocket, that silver necklace with the initials EV. "You dropped this in the sheets and I kept it. Carried it with me every day since then because it was the only thing I had of you." And Eleanor looked at the necklace, feeling more tears stream down her face. "I looked for this necklace for so long. It was my father's." And Alexander carefully placed the necklace back around her neck. "Now it's back where it belongs, just like I'm back with you." And Eleanor looked into his eyes. "But what about the divorce and everything that happened?" And Alexander shook his head. "Forget the divorce, forget everything. The only thing that matters now is that we've found each other and that we have a son, and I'm not going to let you run away again." And he leaned in and kissed her. And it was a different kiss from the one that night in the bar. It was a softer, more tender kiss, a kiss that promised not just passion but also care. And when they parted, Eleanor whispered, "I'm afraid you'll hate me for all of this, for asking for a divorce, for hiding the pregnancy. but Alexander held her face between his hands. "I don't hate you, Eleanor, I love you. I think I fell in love with you that first night and didn't even know it. And now that I've found you again, I'm not letting you go." And Eleanor smiled through her tears. "I fell in love with you that night too, and I spent all these months wondering who you were, where you were." And they stayed there holding each other until the nurse returned and said Eleanor could go see the baby. And Alexander helped her up, and they went together to the neonatal ICU. And when they got there and saw that tiny baby inside the incubator, with the tubes and monitors, they both began to cry, because he was perfect, he was a miracle. And Alexander placed his hand on the glass of the incubator and said softly, "Hi son, I'm your father, and I promise I will take care of you and your mother forever." And Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder, and for the first time in months she felt that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. In the following days, Alexander didn't leave the hospital, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair beside Eleanor's bed, and constantly going to the neonatal ICU to see his son. It was during one of those moments, as he stood before the incubator looking at the baby who weighed only 2 pounds and 10 ounces, that he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see his father. Arthur Davenport was there with red eyes, looking at his grandson through the glass. He was silent for a long time before speaking. "He has the Davenport eyes." Alexander felt a lump in his throat. "He does, Dad. He's my son. He was always my son from the very beginning." Arthur looked at him confused. "What do you mean from the beginning?" Alexander took a deep breath and told him everything. About the night at the bar, about how he had run from the arranged marriage, about finding Eleanor without knowing who she was, about the night they spent together, about how he had kept the necklace and searched for her for months, and how he only discovered the truth when he saw her name on the divorce papers. Arthur listened in silence, and when Alexander finished, the old man had tears streaming down his face. "So fate played a trick on us, son. We fought so hard against this marriage, and in the end, we discovered it was exactly what was meant to be." Alexander nodded. "Yes, Dad, I love Eleanor. I've loved her since that first night, and now that I know who she is, I'm not letting her go." Arthur placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Then you need to do this right. You need to marry her again. Not in a cold lawyer's office with separately signed papers, but in a real ceremony, before God and the family. You need to show everyone that she is your real wife, and that this boy is the Davenport heir." Alexander smiled. "That's exactly what I intend to do, Dad. As soon as she and the baby get out of here, I'm going to throw the most beautiful wedding New York has ever seen." Eleanor was lying in her hospital bed when Chloe appeared, walking into the room with that fake smile and a bouquet of flowers. "Hi, Ellie. I came to see how you are." Eleanor looked at her with a cold expression Chloe had never seen before. "You shouldn't have come here, Chloe." The other woman feigned surprise. "Why are you talking to me like that?" "I'm your friend." But Eleanor sat up in bed with difficulty. "A friend? You went to the Davenport mansion and told everyone about my pregnancy. You exposed me, you humiliated me, and you think that's what a friend does?" Chloe tried to defend herself. "I was just trying to help you." "I thought it was better for them to know." But Eleanor shook her head. "No, you weren't trying to help me. You were trying to destroy me, and I was foolish not to see it sooner, not to see that you've always been jealous of me." Just then, Alexander entered the room, and when he saw Chloe, his expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" Chloe turned to him with the seductive smile she always used. "Hi, Alex. I came to visit Eleanor. We've been friends for a long time." But Alexander took a step forward, his gaze cold. "Friends? Friends don't do what you did. You took advantage of Eleanor's vulnerability to try to destroy her, and I know why. The investigators I hired found out everything about you. They found out how you tried to get close to me at the company. How furious you were when you heard about the marriage. How you tried to use the information Eleanor trusted you with to end her marriage." Chloe turned pale. "That's not true." But Alexander continued, "Yes, it is. And there's more. I found out you tried to spread rumors at the company about Eleanor, tried to tarnish her reputation with other employees. And that ends today. You're fired. I don't want you near my company, near my family, and especially not near my wife." Chloe felt her mask fall, all the anger and envy she had stored for months exploding at once. "Your wife? She doesn't deserve you, Alexander. She doesn't deserve anything she has." I was the one who deserved to be in her place. I worked, I strived, I did everything right, and she just had to exist, and everything fell into her lap. Eleanor got out of bed despite the pain. You think everything fell into my lap, Chloe? I lost my father, I lost my mother. I was left alone in the world, forced to marry a man I didn't know. I spent months living in fear and guilt, had a premature birth and almost lost my son. You think that's luck? You think I would wish this life on anyone? Chloe was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of rage. I hate you, Eleanor. I've always hated you. Ever since I found out you were marrying Alexander, you're nothing but a futureless orphan who doesn't know the value of what she has. Alexander stepped in front of Eleanor, protecting her. Get out of here now, Chloe, before I call security. Chloe looked at them both one last time, hatred etched on her face, and slammed the door as she left. Eleanor collapsed into Alexander's arms, crying. I trusted her. I told her everything. Alexander held her tight. I know, my love, but it's over. She won't hurt you anymore, I promise. The weeks passed and the baby grew stronger, gaining weight, his lungs developing, and finally, after 2 months in the neonatal ICU, the doctors said he could be discharged. Eleanor and Alexander cried with joy when the nurse placed their small but healthy baby in her arms. Alexander looked at them, at his wife and his son, and felt his chest explode with love. They took the baby home, not to the apartment in the West Village, but to the Davenport mansion on the Upper East Side, because Arthur had insisted that was where they should live, where the family should be together. When they walked through the door with the baby in their arms, the whole family was waiting. The aunts who had spoken ill of Eleanor were now there with gifts and sheepish smiles. Arthur took his grandson in his arms carefully. The tough man who never showed emotion was crying openly. Welcome to the family, little Gabriel Davenport. That was the name they had chosen, Gabriel, meaning God is my strength, and it was perfect because the baby had fought so hard to survive. Eleanor looked around at the enormous mansion that was now her home, at the family that was now hers too, and for the first time since her mother died, she felt she was no longer alone in the world, that she had found a true home. Alexander organized the wedding for 3 months later, when Gabriel was stronger and Eleanor had fully recovered from childbirth. It was a beautiful ceremony at St. James's Church on Madison Avenue, with white flowers decorating the entire altar, with the whole family present, with friends and acquaintances from New York high society who had come to celebrate. When Eleanor walked down the aisle in a white dress, holding a bouquet of roses, with Gabriel in Arthur's arms in the front row, Alexander felt tears stream down his face because she was so beautiful, so radiant, so different from the sad-eyed young woman he had met in that East Village bar months ago. When she reached him and the priest began the ceremony, Alexander held her hands and said the vows he had written. Eleanor, I found you on the darkest night of my life, when I was running from a destiny I thought I didn't want. You showed me that sometimes destiny knows better than we do, that sometimes things happen exactly as they are meant to. And I promise to spend the rest of my life loving you, protecting you and making you happy. Because you and Gabriel are my everything now. Eleanor was crying when she said her vows. Alexander, on that night in the bar I was broken, destroyed, lost. And you took me in without even knowing who I was. And without knowing it, you were already saving me. Today I promise to love you every day, to build a beautiful family with you, to honor the memory of my parents by making this life we have together something beautiful and true. And when the priest said they could kiss, the kiss they shared was witnessed by the entire church, and people applauded, and Gabriel started to cry as if he knew it was a special moment. After the ceremony, there was a reception at the mansion, with live music, abundant food, French champagne, and Eleanor danced with Alexander in the middle of the ballroom to the same slow song that had played in that East Village bar. He whispered in her ear, "Remember the first time we danced?" She smiled. "How could I forget? It was the night that changed my life." He spun her slowly. "It changed mine too, my love. It changed everything." The years passed and the family grew. Gabriel grew up strong and healthy, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's sweet smile. When he turned 3, he got a little sister, Helen, and 2 years later, a younger brother, Peter. The Davenport mansion became full of life, full of children's laughter, full of love. Eleanor transformed. She was no longer that scared and lonely girl. She was a strong, confident woman who managed social projects in the family's name, helping disadvantaged families as hers had once been, making a difference in other people's lives. Alexander looked at her with pride because she had become not just his wife but his partner in everything. Before he died at 75, Arthur called his son and daughter-in-law for a talk. He was weak, lying in his bed in the mansion, and he held both their hands. "I want to thank you for giving me the joy of seeing this family grow, of knowing my grandchildren, of seeing your love blossom. And Alexander, I want you to know that I am proud of the man you've become, the father you are, the dedicated husband you've turned into." Alexander was crying. "Thank you, Dad, for everything, for making that promise to Eleanor's father, for insisting on the marriage even when I fought against it, because without it, I would have never found her." Arthur looked at Eleanor. "And you, my girl, you have honored your parents' memory. You honored the promise your mother extracted from you on that deathbed. You became a true Davenport, and I am proud to call you my daughter." Eleanor kissed her father-in-law's forehead, crying, "Thank you for welcoming me, for giving me a family when I had no one left." That night, Arthur died peacefully, knowing he had fulfilled the promise he made to his friend, knowing he had secured the future of Vance's granddaughter, knowing he had united two families in a way even he could not have imagined. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Alexander took Eleanor back to the bar in the East Village where it all began. The place still existed, somewhat renovated but retaining the essence of that simple joint with live music. They sat at the same table, ordered the same drinks, and when the band started playing that slow song, Alexander extended his hand. "Want to dance?" Eleanor smiled, accepting. "Always." They danced in the middle of that bar as they had 10 years ago. But now they were no longer two strangers running from pain. They were husband and wife, parents of 3 beautiful children. They were a family. When the music ended, Alexander held her face in his hands. "You know I love you more today than I did on that first night?" Eleanor rested her forehead against his. "I know, because I love you more with each passing day, too." He took a small box from his pocket, and when he opened it, Eleanor saw the silver necklace with the initials EV, the same one she had lost that night 10 years ago. But now it had been refurbished, polished, and next to it was another charm, the initials AD for Alexander Davenport. "I had my initials added too," he explained, placing the necklace around her neck, "because now we are together forever." Eleanor touched the 2 charms. "Forever," she repeated, and they kissed there in the middle of the bar while the people around them smiled, seeing the clearly enamored couple, unaware of the whole story, unaware of everything they had been through to get there. Gabriel grew up to be a responsible young man who studied engineering, wanting to continue the family's real estate legacy. Helen became a lawyer specializing in children's rights, inspired by her mother's story. And Peter chose medicine, wanting to help families as his had been helped. Eleanor looked at her 3 children with a heart overflowing with pride, because each of them carried not only the Davenport name, but also the Vance legacy. They carried the story of the grandparents they never met, but who had fought so hard to give their family a better future. One Christmas night, when everyone was gathered at the mansion, with Eleanor's grandchildren running in the garden, with the whole family around the bountiful table, Alexander stood up and asked for their attention. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, raising his champagne glass. "A toast to Eleanor, the woman who transformed my life, who taught me what true love is, who gave me 3 wonderful children and a family I didn't know I needed." Everyone raised their glasses, and Eleanor was crying with emotion. He continued, "And a toast as well to those who are gone, to Mr. and Mrs. Vance who raised this incredible woman, and to my father Arthur, who had the wisdom to make a promise and insist that it be kept. Because without them, none of this would exist." Everyone drank, and then Gabriel asked to speak too. "I want to thank my parents for telling me your story since I was little, for not hiding anything, for teaching me that sometimes love is born in the most unexpected places, and that destiny has plans we don't understand at first, but that makes sense in the end." Eleanor looked at her eldest son, the premature baby who had fought so hard to survive and was now a strong, good man, and she felt she had fulfilled the promise she made to her mother on that deathbed so many years ago. She had married the Davenport heir and built a beautiful life. She had honored her parents' memory. She had created a legacy that would continue for generations. Eleanor died at 83, surrounded by her family, in the same bed in the Davenport mansion where she had slept for over 50 years beside Alexander. He held her hand until her last breath, and when she closed her eyes for the last time, there was a smile on her face. The smile of someone who lived fully, who loved and was loved, who fulfilled all her promises and received much more than she ever expected. The funeral was immense, with hundreds of people who had been touched by her generosity, by the social initiatives she had developed, by the lives she had transformed. Alexander spoke at the ceremony with a choked voice. "My wife was an extraordinary woman. She lost everything very early in life, but never lost her capacity to love, to care, to make a difference. And I was blessed to have spent more than 50 years by her side, to have built a beautiful family with her, to have learned from her what truly matters in life." And Gabriel, Helen and Peter were there crying, surrounded by their own children and grandchildren, because the family Eleanor and Alexander had built was enormous now, strong, united. Alexander lived for 5 more years after her death, 5 years in which he visited her grave every day, in which he told his great-grandchildren stories about the incredible great-grandmother they had. And when his time finally came, he died peacefully, knowing he had lived a life full of meaning, full of love, and was buried beside Eleanor. And on their headstone was written, "Alexander and Eleanor Davenport, united by destiny, separated only by death, together for all eternity." End of story. And so ends the story of Eleanor and Alexander, a story that began with pain and ended with love, that began with a promise extracted on a deathbed and ended with a family legacy that spanned generations. And if you are reading or listening to this story now, remember that sometimes the most difficult moments in life are just the beginning of something wonderful. That sometimes destiny has better plans than our own. That love can be born in the most unexpected places and under the most unlikely circumstances. And that it is never too late to start over, to believe, to surrender. So if you enjoyed this story, if it touched your heart in some way, leave a like down below. Subscribe to the Touching Stories channel so you don't miss any of the next moving stories we're going to tell, and share in the comments where you're watching from. What part of the story moved you the most? If you've ever gone through something similar in your life, because your participation is very important to us. It's what motivates us to keep bringing these stories that warm the heart and make us believe that there is always hope, there is always a second chance, there is always love waiting for us somewhere. Thank you for following along, and until the next story from Touching Stories, God bless you and your family.